Hello everyone, this is Megan Vierick following up with a second video on how to make a scatter plot. So where we've been so far is we titled our sheet, we set up two tabs at the bottom, one for raw data, and the nice feature about the raw data tab is as you come in here and maybe between the first and second time I went through things, I was able to get another set of data points and I could record them. Apparently I missed day 2, doesn't really matter. This will allow you to kind of update everything in real time, which is nice so that you don't continuously have to go back and work on multiple things. The other nice thing is you could kind of treat this like the original page of your lab notebook, where really nothing should be adjusted or messed with. And then when you come over here, this is kind of your duplicate page. So you'll notice this particular portion transferred. This part didn't because I didn't drag it all the way down. That's a pretty easy fix. Again, if I just grab the bottom right corner of this particular spot and drag it down, it'll populate with those values. And again, the nice thing is that my averages, if I needed them for something else, we can update. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go ahead and do a scatter plot. So there's a couple of different ways that you can make a graph in Sheets. One is you can go to Insert and then Chart. And what this will do is this will open up a blank chart for you, and then you can go and add stuff in. Personally, this is my favorite way to do it because I have much more control over every step of the way. However, I understand as a beginning person working with these, this may not be your best bet. So if I delete that, another option I have is I can kind of grab my data. I can still do Insert Chart, but now what happens is that Sheets or Excel, whatever program you're using, makes a judgment call on what they think is the most appropriate for your data. So you can see here with the scatter plot, they're comparing our first column, which is shown right here, to our second column, and that makes sense. That's really our independent variable. Here's kind of our dependent variable, or here's one factor and then the second factor. You can see that our axis is already formatted, and we can see that our axis here is already formatted. And again, this is why I really like to put my units up here. It saves me the time to add them on later because they're already set up in my graph. So this looks pretty great as is. What I would personally do is add a little bit of customization in here. So let me show you how to do that. Let's just say, for example, though, really quickly, that this is not the type of graph that you wanted. If you notice there's a little drop down arrow here, I can change it to whatever I think is more appropriate. So again, Sheets makes an attempt based on the data you provided, but if you would rather have maybe a table chart of those values to insert into a document, you could do that. Or maybe if you changed your mind and you know what, I really did want this as a histogram for whatever reason, or a bar graph or a line graph, it gives you those options so you don't really have to go back and delete it. But I do like this adjusted one, which is a scatter plot. I like all my values here. My x-axis is it's already grabbing that. If for some reason I didn't like those headers, I can actually check these boxes here and I can kind of adjust what's going on. But again, these are set up in a way that look really good for my data, so I'm going to leave them. So instead, I'm going to come over here to the Customize tab. And you see there's all these different options. I usually don't mess with chart style. If you do this, you can really maximize the size if you wanted to maybe create your own custom axes, but it's not necessary here. So we're going to look at chart and axis title, and that's where I'm really going to do the bulk of mine. I do want to make sure that I add a figure number. And again, we don't want to say something like, oh, the figure in the left or the figure in the right, only because that becomes pretty vague for your user or your viewer or the person who's reading your post or whatever the case is. So by putting a figure 2 in, it makes it much more objective. So in your research paper or in a poster, you can say, as shown in figure 2, we can take care of that. The other thing that I don't really like from this is I don't like scatter plots to use the word verse. I personally just think it sounds better if I'm more descriptive. So I'm going to go ahead and change that to distance traveled by larvae. And I want to be specific here because at this point, it's not very clear why they're moving in the first place. All as we know is that as they are different ages, it seems they're moving different distances. But I want to be a little bit more specific because my general rule of thumb is that you should include any variables that are shown in your graph, usually an entity being studied. In this case, it's larvae of something. They would be fruit fly larvae, the made up example I have. And then I would want to know what that entity is. So my entity here is when exposed to light. So what I would encourage you to do right now is take a look at your data, pause the video, see if you want to change your title, and then resume when you're ready to see a couple more features we can do for this graph. One thing I do want to mention that makes it a little bit difficult here is we can play with alignment, color, and size. I usually try to bump up the sizes as much as I can just to make it clearer to the reader. But let's say instead I wanted to be specific on the type of larvae, and I said they were fruit fly larvae, and I wanted to include their scientific name, at least their genus name. This becomes difficult because what happens is I cannot specify italicizing this part. You'll notice that for italics, it's in either all or nothing. So if you run into this particular issue, what you may want to do is instead, you may want to actually delete this entire thing out and just put a space in as a placeholder and potentially even continue a bunch of spaces so you have a spot here, and then you need to add a text box. However, I don't have to worry about that, so I'm just going to kind of leave mine here. But in the series, let's say you want to change the color. You don't really like the color blue. It doesn't show up well. You have options here. I usually default to black and white just to increase contrast. I can also change the shape if it looks a little bit cleaner to do maybe an X mark or a square. You have some options of customization there. And you can also change them too. So if you have points that are overlapping, like you can see here, for better resolution, it might be better to make those points smaller so that your viewer can get a better idea of the spread. Because again, here, it becomes hard to see exactly how many data points there are per time period. I can also put error bars on here if I was interested in doing that. And what I would recommend is if you want to do that, you would need to add standard deviation. I would view the column graph video that I put out, and you can see how to do that because it would be the exact same setup. I personally am not going to add them on this chart, but I absolutely could. If we go back to customize, the other things I can play with is the horizontal and vertical axis. So again, what I typically like to do is I like to try to, click the wrong thing, I apologize. I try to bump up the font size if I can, just to make it a little bit easier for our viewers. So you can see I just changed those numbers so they're a little bit larger. And I can also do that down here with the vertical axis. I can change those numbers so they're a little bit larger, just to make things a little easier on the eyes. These boxes as well, they're under the chart titles, so I can go ahead and bump them up. The problem with sheets though is it does not auto text wrap, and there is no way to get around that. So as you're increasing your size, if you make it too big, you'll notice it just cuts it off here, and there's really nothing you can do about that. So your two possible solutions are to either find the exact size where it's just big enough, or you could, again, delete the space out. You could then put in a text box and you could customize it in that particular spot. So it's really a judgment call for you what makes the most sense. But I can go again in chart titles, and I can come down here to font size, and I can make that a little bit bigger. In addition, you can also resize the entire chart area. If that helps, that also gives you more space in both spots. So that is it for this video. Scatter plots tend to be pretty easy to make. This one does a really good job of defaulting in Google Sheets. All you can do is really just some customization to make it better. But if you wanted to add those error bars again, I would recommend going to the column graph video and setting that up. The purpose of having an error bar, if you want one, is it just gives you an idea of how much spread there is, how much variance or difference between your data points, which really helps as a point of comparison. So we can see, for example, just qualitatively looking at this, between days 2 and 3, there's not much of a difference. Between day 3 and 4, there is a pretty large jump. And if we saw the error bars were very small around this, that would lead us to believe that something's really happening here during this day that might be important to investigate. Whereas if my error bars are really wide, then it could just be variance between those larvae at that point. Thank you for watching.